Welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast, hosted by Dave Roberts. Humanity possesses a unique skill, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This podcast embraces that ability, offering learning opportunities through conversations with extraordinary guests. Dave aims to leave a positive mark on individuals around the world. So before you dive into today's episode, please share this podcast with your network, including friends, family, and colleagues. And please consider leaving a rating or review. Your support makes all the difference.
To another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, and today it is my pleasure to welcome back for an encore appearance, Michelle Ann Collins. As the founder of Inhabit Joy, Michelle Ann Collins partners with individuals who have suffered grief, injury, or other types of loss as they recover, reclaim their wholeness, and build resilience for life's inevitable challenges. After a series of losses, including the death of her mother, her husband's suicide, and estrangements from primary family members, Michelle combined the tools she has collected as a yoga therapist and wellness coach and studies in positive psychology, neuroscience, meditation and mindfulness, and spirituality to turn post-traumatic stress disorder into post-traumatic growth and resilience. With the addition of certifications in grief education and grief yoga and several best-selling books in which she shares her story, Michelle helps others transform from barely surviving to joyful thriving. Michelle teaches and coaches in private, corporate, and small group settings and enjoys sharing her skills and experience through speaking and facilitating workshops and retreats. Deeply connected with the healing powers of nature, Michelle spends her leisure time hiking among the trees or paddling on the rivers near her home in Portland, Oregon. And Michelle, welcome back for another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast.
I have to shorten that bio. It was hard to listen to that whole thing. So I have to teach you something since this is the teaching podcast.
Okay.
We out here in Oregon pronounce it Oregon, not Oregon. So you're in the know.
So it's Oregon.
Yes,
Perfect.
You're a quick learner. Yeah. We even have T-shirts that are spelled OrYgun to get people to pronounce it correctly.
I will have to remember that. It's like when I visited my friend Patty Farino and her husband out in Lancaster, South Carolina, but I was told it's Lancaster. So I have to apply that teaching and generalize that to Oregon.
Yeah. Oregon. Very excellent. Perfect.
My wife says I'm a quick learner too. That's why I stayed married for 41 years.
Wow. That's congratulations.
Thanks. It has been quite an adventure, but quite an adventure. So anyway, tell our audience, what have you been up to since your last appearance on the Teaching Journeys podcast?
What have I been up to? So many things. Doing some more corporate work, helping design grief, bereavement leave, sort of reintegration, teaching employees how to bring someone who's been on bereavement leave back into the fold, and expectations, that kind of thing. That's just really something I'm very passionate about, is how educating people how to treat grievers, because it makes the grief journey so much easier when the people around you know what to say, what not to say. And so that's a passion project of mine. Doing a lot of coaching, of people who are in bereavement, which I love. Writing, working on my next book, and just keeping busy studying mindfulness and I'm actually in a training, talk about love of learning, a 2-year mindfulness meditation teacher training through Sounds True, which I am just nourished by. I love learning about these teachings.
Yeah, I think the day we stop being inquisitive learners or we lose our desire to learn is the day we probably got to check to see if we still got a pulse. Be-
Yeah. I think curiosity is one of the best ways to stay young and vibrant and clear minded.
Well, the best teachers I know, Michelle, are the best students I know.
Mm, right. And we all learn as teachers from our students. That's one of
Yeah,
my favorite things about coaching the one to one process because every session that I have, when I'm able to, take a moment to process and witness my client's process, I'm learning a new way. It's not all about what I've been through and what I know. Every single person teaches me a new way to get through challenges, and it's so beautiful.
our clients are the best source of information and inspiration.
And our children, don't forget them.
That's right. Our children, our pets, they all have something to teach us. So when we left off with the last podcast, we talked more about, I think, your personal journey and how that translated into you getting involved in holistic therapies and mindfulness meditation and yoga. And one of the things that we had talked about was somatic therapy. So what is somatic therapy? What are the specific interventions involved?
Well, I appreciate the topic because I hope you're right and that most people don't know very much about it. Because if you haven't been through trauma therapy, if you haven't hopefully been through a trauma, then yeah, why would you have heard of it unless you're a practitioner? And I just want to clarify, I'm not a licensed therapist. My somatic therapy training comes from my mindfulness practices, mindfulness learning, and also my own experience being in trauma and having had somatic therapy. So I just want to make sure that the audience is clear that there are people out there who know a lot more about it than I do, but I do have enough experience to speak from, from the heart about it. When I first developed PTSD after my husband died by suicide, my regular therapist, who had been more of a relationship therapist throughout our time together, my time with my husband, um, she's the one who recognized the symptoms that I was describing to her as PTSD. I really didn't know what was happening with me. I just knew that I was having dissociative episodes. And what that means is I'm actually not where my body is. And I can describe that really quickly. I always find stories being much more illustrative because if you've never had a dissociative episode, you can't understand what it means. I'm not where my body is. What does that even mean? Well, let me explain. So the first time it ever happened to me, I was just in a grocery store parking lot, totally innocent on the way to my car with my little grocery cart. Now, my husband died in a car, and I discovered his body in that car. And the same make and model car had parked next to my car I was approaching with my grocery cart. When I saw that car, it triggered an episode. And my mind, was back at the scene of his death. My body was still in the grocery store parking lot. And several minutes actually went by where I have no memory of what was happening where my body was during that time. I came back into association. I was sitting in the front of my car in my driver's seat sobbing. And my poor daughter, I feel so bad she had to witness this. She was with me and she just put her hand on my shoulder. Mommy, are you okay? And I realized we had put the groceries in the back of the car, opened the car, put the groceries in, gotten in, and I was gone. I was not present for that moment. So these episodes obviously can be incredibly disturbing to your life. I had another one happen while I was driving. Uh, and that is even scarier
Mm.
because you want to be where you are when you're driving.
Mhm.
So when I described these episodes to my therapist, she said, this is PTSD. This is what one of the symptoms of PTSD looks like. And we need to find you a trauma therapist who is well educated and experienced in. Her suggestion was EMDR. So, getting more directly to the answer to your question, EMDR is one of the modalities that trauma therapists, skilled trauma therapists, can use to help people work the trauma through their bodies. And a very important piece here that we can thank Bessel van der Kolk, and if you've never heard of him, Your Body Keeps the Score.
Mhm.
There's another book, Your Body Speaks Your Mind. I always mix those two up, but I think his is the score. We have to remember that whatever happens to us, whatever we take in with our senses, also has a mirror effect on our physical body.
Mhm.
So I don't believe there is such a thing as mental health separate from physical health. And most mind body integrative practitioners will agree with me. So imagine how unwell you have to be so disintegrated that your mind and body aren't in the same place.
Mhm.
That's PTSD. That's trauma. So EMDR is one type of somatic therapy, which I did not actually choose to engage in, but I want to make sure people know about it because it can be incredibly effective. Uh, I have not done it, so but one thing to, and it has to do with moving your eyes in certain directions while replaying or revisiting your trauma. And most of the somatic therapy, probably all, involves that same thing. It's bringing your mind to the triggering event and then reestablishing safety in your body, staying in your body. So the ones that worked best, I'm sorry, I'm going to pause in case you have any questions so far.
I'm good. Keep going.
Okay. Just want to make sure. So somatic refers to the body. That's it probably Latin word. Um, Medically, anything somatic refers to the body. And when you disconnect, like I was explaining, from the body, you're very unwell. So in yoga, yoga is a mindful physical practice and obviously a spiritual path as well. Although
Mhm.
in the West here, it's become more. I read the other day there's a yoga competition, which is the biggest oxymoron. I mean, all the ancient yogis in the East are just laughing at we Westerners. That's
Yeah.
not yoga. Yoga
I
is a
th-
path to spiritual enlightenment.
well, yeah, I think given what the yogi masters had intended for yoga, I would see them laughing. It isn't about a
Yes.
competition. It's about creating total spiritual awareness and a way to obviously, coordinate movement with thought.
Right. Yes. And yoga itself translates, you can read different translations, but it translates as oneness, wholeness,
Mm,
or the yoking of the mind and the body together.
mm,
So it really means the opposite of dissociation, which I never put that together until, I mean, I'd been a yogi for 15, 17 years, something like that, before I went through my somatic therapy. I was already a yoga therapist at that
mhm.
point and still not able to use my tools. It's so important to go to a practitioner who is well trained and has experience if you have trauma. It's so important because it's very, very delicate. So for me, my particular experience on my trauma therapist's couch was life changing, not just for me surviving trauma, PTSD, and learning how to maintain embodiment when faced with a challenge, when faced with a trigger or an activation of trauma. I don't like to use the word trigger, and guess why? Because my husband used a gun
Mhm.
to end his life. And when people say trigger, for many years, that was a trigger for me. I would
Mhm.
immediately picture a gun and what I had seen when I discovered his body and be activated, my trauma would be activated. So I wouldn't be able to be present for whatever the next words were. So even if I didn't have a full-blown dissociation, I would have an activation of my trauma and not be able to be present for whatever came after that word. Now, with working with somatic therapy, I have been able to now hear that word and stay present. Another activator was people do this a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It is a gesture that until you are traumatized by gun violence, you would never think twice about doing that, right?
No.
If someone did that within the first couple of years after my husband died, I'd be gone. I would sweat, I would shake, I would have to do what I'm going to get to in a minute about the somatic therapy training,
Mm-hmm.
basically, that I had to stay embodied so that I wouldn't just have to cry or run or, the first couple of years, it was a lot of turning to alcohol and drugs. Um, I, a little over 2 years after Glenn died, I stopped using alcohol, and that has been a huge boost
Mm-hmm.
to my health and well-being. You It's really hard to heal when you're numbing yourself
Well, it is.
because again, that takes you out.
Mm-hmm. It Any type of self-medication prevents you from feeling what you need to feel and actively cognitively processing the event so that you can reestablish identity in a changed world. And it's
Yeah.
a temporary fix. But trauma tends to do that. I mean,
Yeah.
especially the trauma you experienced with Glenn and his suicide. Um, there's a correlation between individuals who had PTSD and substance abuse. That's been a correlation that's been proven for a long time. And
And very understandable because
mhm,
it's really uncomfortable.
mhm,
It's horrible. And
I
that's
know.
what I came to my therapist with.
Mhm,
I said, "This can't happen. I can't live this way.
no.
This is horrible. I don't know what I'm doing when I'm away from my body." And it is. It's awful. So right now, here's a great example. Talking about this just now has activated me. And with the therapy and the practice that I have, I can notice that I'm activated. My heart
Mhm,
rate's up. My body feels warm. I'm starting to have a little glow, um, little flush.
mhm,
All my muscles are tense. And so my somatic therapy practice is, and it's nothing different than yoga and mindfulness. They're all the same thing. So I take a deep breath. You can practice this with me in case this conversation has activated anyone else. Deep breath. And what I do for sort of the immediate moment, because I'm here in a podcast, I can't go running outside or whatever. I feel my hands on my knees. I feel my feet on the floor. I connect to nature, even though I'm in my house. Energetically, I can connect to the earth and I breathe. I focus on my breath. Deep breathing. In and out through the nose is a little bit more calming than in and out through the mouth, but sometimes when you're really activated, you can't do that. So, and I feel my heart rate slowing. I feel the flesh calming down. I feel the weight of my body instead of feeling like I'm about to leave my body. And again, that might be very confusing to people who aren't somatically aware, but it's something that just takes practice. And I'm back. And that's all it takes now. I can do it in a matter of a minute or so, where before, at the beginning, it would be how soon can I get to, some drug or alcohol uh, to, and that wouldn't help me get embodied or process the trauma, but it would give me some relief as far as the suffering,
mhm.
the horror, and the so uncomfortable, you know. So back to did you? I'm going to stop there if you have any response, and then I'll go on to talking about my therapy.
I think just that technique in and of itself is a very simple way to get recentered, to get grounded, because when
Mhm.
you're doing your breath work, you can inhale in positivity or calmness and exhale fear and disconnection. And
Mhm.
the thing you talked about with dissociation, and dissociation can be a life-saving defense in a lot of ways. But when
Mhm.
we do that, like you said, when it's consistent that we're doing that, and we're dissociating from our own body, our own experience, that's when it gets to be problematic. And you mentioned triggers; it could be anything. It could be a noise. It could be if a person was abused and that was the activating event for PTSD. They see somebody in the environment who looks like their abuser, who sounds like
Yeah.
their abuser. All of this
Or the word
can
trigger.
activate, or the word trigger. Yeah. Yep. And I think what's important, and I think your your discussion of how trigger is a trigger because of how Glenn took his life. We have to I've learned to be more mindful with the individuals that I do grief with in terms of what I say and how I say it. So if an individual died by suicide and it was through choking, I'm not going to, use terms that have hanging in it. Or if it's a gun, I'm not going to say, well, I'm going to shoot my mouth off. I'm not going to say
Mm.
things like that. And if I do that, I'm going to walk it back real quickly or check with the individual, acknowledge that that was the wrong term to say, and apologize for any um, unintentional concern that I may have caused them. And that's why I think it's important with the work that you're doing is to show individuals how to sit for individuals who are grieving, what to say, what not to say, what to do, how to be present for them. Because that's something that it's not an innate skill in the society. It's something that we need to learn more and more of. And particularly, um, particularly in this state of affairs now, we need to learn how to be present for individuals who've gone through trauma.
Yeah, yeah, and I really appreciate everything you just said. Uh, the awareness of your speech is so important and a skill that it's a constant practice. It's something that I work hard on every day, every conversation I have, and it, it's hard. It's hard work, but when you learn the value of it to yourself and the person that you're speaking with. So you are in the very low percentage of people that are thinking because I have heard everything. And what I learned after a couple, probably 2 or 3 years out, is that I can't control my environment. I can't never see a gun. I can't never have someone walk up and do this in front of me. You don't what the only thing that we have control over is our reactions to these stimuli.
Mhm.
My favorite quote from Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and a psychotherapist, and it's been paraphrased so many thousands of times, but still one of my favorite explanations when you're talking about mindfulness. In between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is your freedom to choose your reaction, your response, your life. Your whole life is based on stimulus and response, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So you get to choose, and when you are mindful, when you can make that space long enough to be thoughtful, what is the most healthy response? What is the most beneficial response to me and the person I'm interacting with or to my environment? Simple things like, can I choose a glass container over a plastic container?
Mhm.
Can I, choose an additional vegetable instead of additional carb in my lunch today? Little things. It doesn't have to be anything really big, but living a mindful life is a choice that with practice of mindfulness, you can improve any aspect of your life, including circling back around, uh, surviving trauma.
Mhm.
And my life, yeah, I have this terrible experience, a number of terrible experiences, as you've, read in my bio and more that aren't even in there. But it's not what happens to you. Viktor Frankl he's writing this when he's in a concentration camp
Hmm.
where every day he doesn't know if he's going to be killed or not.
Hmm.
He's sick and not being fed proper nutrition and losing friends every day. And he comes up with this theory in that extreme circumstance. So we can do it when we're in the grocery store
Hmm.
or post traumatic. So, my
Hmm.
experience, are you ready for me to dive into the somatic therapy experience?
I am, and I just want to say this before I forget it. Well, you're referring to Viktor Frankl. I know it's the one of the best books of our generation, and you're right. He wrote that
Yeah.
book when he was in a concentration camp.
Man's Search for Meaning. It is translated. He didn't write it in English. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, Man's Search for Meaning. So yeah,
It's it's really a foundational book. Again, back to mindfulness.
mhm.
And people in the modern mindfulness movement, everyone refers to that book. And he isn't referred to as the father of modern mindfulness because he is so many other things, but he certainly could be.
He- for sure, for sure. Um,
Yeah, to be able to be in your creative, helpful mind when you are under such extreme duress and fear for your life, that is some mindfulness.
you
That
got
is that is very deep control over
it.
yourself.
Now, somatic therapy, I'm sure, has a variety of different interventions that are attached to that. How do you decide when a client comes in and says, I need somatic therapy, or am I a candidate for somatic therapy? How do you decide which specific interventions you use within that construct?
That's a great question. And I think it is very individual. It depends on what the practitioner offers and what the client feels is going to help,
Mm.
is going to be the most beneficial. For me, in my experience, I went into this particular therapist because she offered EMDR and my therapist recommended it. Once I got in there and we started working together, I developed a fear of EMDR. Even though I had done some research, I knew it was incredibly effective. I was activated by the idea of EMDR, and that was my own, trauma brain. So I chose not to. And fortunately, because I was at such a good therapist, she had many, many other types of modalities that she could use. And the one that worked best for me was just the embodiment, the breath, kind of like the grounding exercise I just walked us through. And I'll describe my experience. So I'm sitting on her couch, very trauma friendly room, right? The lighting, the odor of a scented candle or not scented. If you're scent sensitive, she would ask that. Um, Everything around was very calming, right? Pictures of flowers, and I know that might even sound kind of hokey, but our connection with nature is our disconnection from nature is one of the things that causes our mental dis-ease in our
Mhm.
society. Outside, she had a big window that looked out over some trees, and connecting to those trees, again, it sounds so silly if you haven't experienced it, was one of the ways that I could stay embodied. And staying embodied is the goal. Not just staying embodied, but recognizing. So it starts out, I'm talking, right? It's therapy. And I start getting activated, but I don't notice because I'm not so
Mhm.
somatic therapy oriented yet, right? I haven't learned about it. And my therapist, being the brilliant person that she is, recognizes this, interrupts my story, which really irritated me at first because when you, the first thing you want when you're in grief is to be witnessed. But that wasn't the goal of our therapy. The goal of our therapy was to get me to quit dissociating and to be able to handle trauma triggers, trauma activation. So she would say, she put her hand up like this, take a breath. And I needed that. If she talked, I would just talk right over her because I was, trauma. Take a breath and I would get irritated, but it would break the cycle of me being activated, and possibly coming into a dissociative episode. Take a breath, look out at the trees. That's a mindfulness practice, right? You're becoming present where your body is. And then, and this is one of the most crucial steps that still helps me on a daily basis. What am I feeling? And earlier I mentioned how the mind and body are not separate, right? Unless you're in dis-ease. And it took me some time to learn this because I was physically oriented through being, a gymnast and a dancer and a yogi, but only towards pain, to be honest. Oh, that hurts. I better modify. But now it was emotions I was looking at, I was looking for in my body. And this is just crucial, this part of it. To be able to name what you're feeling. And I demonstrated this a little bit with our practice earlier. My chest is tight. I mentioned earlier what the symptoms of activation that I was going through. My chest feels tight. My stomach feels nauseous. These are the answers I would give my therapist. And she'd say, okay, bring your full awareness to that tightness in your chest. And then, like you said before, you can breathe in ease, breathe out tension. And we would do a grounding exercise until that tightness in my chest eased. Now, you can imagine this took a lot of time, a lot of storytelling on my part, a lot of calming, bringing me back. But the benefit, as I demonstrated earlier, is when I start to become activated, because as far as I'm concerned, trauma never actually goes away. You just learn to make it through your activations, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because you get more and more and more and more skilled. So just like I demonstrated, I did a quick grounding exercise and I'm fine. I'm all back. So I would like to, I'm going to pause again for questions, but I would like to tell you a story about a time early on. It was maybe 2 years after Glenn died. So I'd been in trauma therapy a little over a year where I actually was able to, I was very highly triggered and I was able to use these practices to stay embodied. But I'll pause first.
Trauma doesn't go away. We just learn how to manage it. We learn how to integrate it. It's a very similar process with grief. We will continue to grieve for as long as we live, because we will grieve the physical absence of the people in our lives, but it becomes more manageable. It becomes more integrated. We have developed over time more skills, not only to deal with trauma, but to deal with our grief. So that's the one observation that I had, is that there seems to be a parallel with that.
Exactly. Yeah. They're both very disturbing situations to be in, grief and trauma. And with a suicide loss, they're almost always connected.
As you're talking about traumatic death, and you're also talking about stigmatized death. So not only is it the trauma of the loss, but you're also talking about a loss that's stigmatized and is subject to scrutiny by many individuals who don't understand the dynamics.
Exactly. That's
So
why we're doing what we're doing today, right?
that's right. So to create awareness and to hopefully educate some people who may need more knowledge on the subject. So you were going to get into how somatic therapy, how you apply that personally to a situation.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I would have turned it over to you so you can share with our audience how you were able to accomplish that.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So I was at home in the home that Glenn and I shared, and it was actually for sale. His estate had closed a few months earlier, and so I was able to finally put my house on the market. And obviously a very disturbing time, right? I'm kind of activated all the time and not, still interfering with my healing by a very regular alcohol consumption. Um, Everything else was pretty good as far as like I was back to my yoga and meditation and all that. So the Uh, Someone was in the house doing measurement, and they had a laser pointer. And I didn't know that they were behind me measuring the kitchen. I had my back to her. And she came up behind me and pointed the laser pointer over my shoulder. Now, why that triggered me, I don't know. The thought that I've given in thinking about it, I'm thinking that I probably pulled the combination of gun violence trauma that I experienced to uh, seeing it on a movie that guns sometimes have laser sights.
Mhm.
It wasn't necessarily part of the actual lived trauma, but it activated me, triggered me. And I didn't just immediately dissociate because at this point I had been practicing and practicing and practicing for this moment, even though it would be preferable to avoid all moments like that because having your trauma activated is incredibly uncomfortable. But this is what happened. I looked at the laser pointer against the wall. I jumped because it scared me, kind of like the hot stove sort of immediate reaction. And that's where the pause came in. That's where I was able to feel my choice only because I had been practicing and in therapy all this time. I felt what felt like I imagine what the coaches feel like when they dump the Gatorade over their shoulders. This immediate, just cold, icy feeling on my back. My arms are numb. My chest is tight.
Mhm.
And my face is flushed like I had experienced earlier, talking about
Mhm.
my earlier trauma. I felt all of this happening, but I was able to notice it and not go into dissociation, not go into reactivity, but tell oh, okay, this is what brings on dissociative episodes. This is a very strong trigger that I have just experienced. So I immediately, instead of losing myself, okay, I looked down at my feet. I'm looking at my feet. My feet are in my shoes. And these are all practices, somatic therapy practices, connecting to your physical body. I can feel my breast. I can feel my hands on my thighs. It wasn't working. I was still going up.
Mhm.
So I took a breath. I zoomed outside. So this was a time when, like on a podcast, if I was triggered, I wouldn't want to have to zoom outside, right? I don't want to stop the
Mhm.
recording. This is why this control is such a gift to have. I can be here with you, sharing my story in hopes that it will help someone else and not lose myself. This is what it's all about. So I zoomed outside, kicked off my shoes because, again, connecting with nature is a very uh, wonderful, effective way
Mhm.
to stay embodied. Kicked off my shoes, I had a big tree in my backyard, stood on where the trunk meets the ground. So it's kind of mushy and soft and cold. And I felt it. And I went to my senses. I can feel my feet in the squishy mud. It still wasn't working. I put my hands on the tree. And yes, it sounds weird even talking about it, but I put my forehead on the tree. I felt the cold moss against my forehead. I felt the tree, the rough bark of the tree. I went back to my breathing. I started to cry. I looked down at my feet and I watched as my feet were dirty at this point. I watched each teardrop touch the top of my foot and make a little clean spot. And I stayed embodied. And I stood there for a little while longer, let myself cry. Crying is a beautiful way to let emotions go through, just like when I was
Mhm.
talking about the tight chest and the breath. It, these things pass. You're not going to cry forever. Your chest isn't going to be tight forever. You do these practices, and I was able to stay embodied. And it took maybe, several minutes that I needed to stay outside. I think my dog followed me out and I pet her for a little while. Touching a pet is, also a wonderful somatic therapy.
Mhm.
That's part of having a therapy pet. My pets aren't therapy pets, but if you have one, um, they're my own. They do help me. If I am feeling uncomfortable and I can go pet one of my dogs or one of my cats. I actually have two of each. Um, that's another podcast. But I was able to stay embodied. I wasn't able to stay in the room, but I wasn't picking on myself for that. I breathed through it. I did all of those practices that there were several practices
Hmm.
that I touched on during that explanation of my experience. And then was able to go back inside and rejoin the meeting that I was having with my realtor instead of having to go get drunk or running around the block or whatever the next thing was to alleviate my pain.
Hmm. What you described is there's a big elephant. There's a big element. Could be a big elephant too, but there's a big element of mindfulness when it comes to applying somatic therapy techniques. And one of the things you mentioned, and I want to say this, is that nature has its own spirit. Nature has um, own calming effects. I think research has shown that even 20 or 30 minutes out in nature has a calming effect on anxiety, reduces blood pressure. And the Japanese have perfected forest bathing. So where you just simply, I think, just go out in the forest and allow just the forest and the surroundings to kind of envelop you. And I believe there's also some structured activities that you can do around forest bathing as well too. But nature has a spirit all of its own. And if you look at the Native American philosophy, they they believe everything has spirit. I mean, the stones, the trees, the water, everything speaks to us. And I mean, I've had times where I've been anxious, times where I have been, just out of sorts, and spent 20 or 30 minutes outside and it just got me regrounded again. So
Yeah.
when in doubt, everybody hug a tree. It
Hug a tree,
works.
right. Or
It
my
works.
favorite thing to do is walk on the beach barefoot. Now, I live in Oregon, so this is not a very common experience, but if I can get to Hawaii,
Hmm.
that is one of the most and there is research, scientific research behind like some sort of the ions in the sea and the sand. Again, not an expert, just read a study on it that can really help you feel grounded. And I actually did a video on my Instagram about that years ago, standing in the ocean or standing on the sand. And again, with my story, barefoot next to the tree, right?
Hmm.
Connecting with nature. And it is exactly what you said. It is mindfulness.
I don't know if you've ever run into this before, but I ran into a situation a long time ago where doing breath work as a form of meditation was a trigger actually for an individual who had lived with somebody where the odors were just unbearable. And he had to hold his breath just to get through that. And that was one of the things that I learned from my clients. He goes, Dave, I can't do breath work because it's a trigger for me.
Yeah.
Um, which is why I think
Yeah.
the individualized approach and the number of, you mentioned dance, you mentioned yoga, you mentioned meditation. I think somatic therapy has such a menu of options.
Yeah.
We can pick what is designed for that individual. But the other thing,
Yeah.
and I know you are very aware of this, you're very aware of an individual's history, and you are going to, with any client that comes in, design a program that's going to have techniques that are basically going to help them reground and not re-trigger them.
Yeah. And I mean, a little bit of activation, a little bit at a time in a safe space is how my trauma therapy worked,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I would tell my story. I'd start to get activated. I'd learn the tools to stay embodied. And it's like training for a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
You start 1 mile at a time and and very, very slowly. And now I can sit here calmly talking to you about my experiences in hopes to help
Mm-hmm.
others. And that's pretty far. I mean, people don't need to get that far to live a comfortable life.
No.
You don't have to share your story, but it is important. You bring up a really important point. Some people can't meditate with their eyes closed.
Mm-hmm.
I always offer when I'm teaching meditation, close your eyes or look down, whatever you're comfortable with.
Mhm.
Some people can't sit comfortably,
Mhm.
usually because of a physical situation, not because of a trauma. But you know what? It's okay to meditate standing up or
Mhm.
lying down.
Mhm.
It's okay to meditate not still.
Mhm.
Thich Nhat Hanh's very famous for teaching his walking meditations, and
Mhm.
in the Buddhist practices that I've been exposed to, it's sit, walk, sit. So you sit for 20 minutes, you walk for 20 minutes, you sit for 20 minutes, or you can even try it for 1 minute. If
Mhm.
20, that's a whole hour. That sounds pretty intimidating, but the idea is just to be fully present in the moment,
Yeah.
fully present. And if that takes movement, if that takes standing, or some people meditate rocking side to side,
Mhm.
um, whatever it takes, you can do a meditation. I'll teach this one really quick. Uh, that is great for anxiety when you can't control your breath and you can't necessarily control your environment. It's just this: touching the fingertips together.
Oh, yeah.
Just that, just being with touching the fingertips together. And the movement helps to bring your attention to it, but you can even, instead of moving, just focus on the connection, fingertips. And this position, in yoga is a very balancing of
Mhm.
the right and left energies of the body. So that's kind of a bonus. But
Mhm.
this is when I teach and use very often. And you can do it if you're in a meeting, right? Or, not driving, obviously, but see, you wouldn't even know I was doing it if I
That's
was in
right.
an online meeting. And say you were in an in-person meeting.
Mhm.
So maybe your hands don't come together, but they're resting on your thigh,
Mhm. And you
thumb, press down, lift up, middle finger, or first finger, middle finger. And you can do that in a meeting. You can do that anytime that you're feeling, great one to use on the plane, for example, if
Mhm.
you're an anxious flyer.
Mhm.
Um, so, it doesn't take years of therapy or hours and hours of practice to find these um, little helpful therapies that you can do in your everyday life to help you get into that pause that Viktor Frankl talked about, so that your reaction, it becomes a thoughtful response instead of a triggered reaction. That's
Yeah.
kind of our goal, right?
It is, and I could see where what even though what you just taught us now could apply to individuals who are grieving, because
Yes.
particularly with grief, and as you know, it affects us physically, it affects us psychologically and emotionally, and particularly cognitively, was when our thoughts seem to be just all over the place and all out of control and so
Right.
overwhelming. Just doing things very simple like touching your fingertips or exerting just moderate pressure on your thigh and just breathing
Hmm.
normally, that in and of itself can get us recentered. And you also mentioned the chest, tightness in the chest. Chest contains our heart, right? It's the heart chakra, which is the home of joy, and it's also the home of sadness. And we carry our grief literally here. We carry that
Hmm.
sadness here. We carry that tightness here. So anything we can do
Absolutely.
to alleviate that, whether it's through mindfulness or through other somatic therapy techniques, is crucial. So, wow.
Yeah. And, I'm going to throw out another simple one. I know we're running close to time here, but this is another one that you can use so easily in any situation that you're in, even if you're driving. I've taught this one to clients to use with who are very anxious drivers. Hands on the steering wheel. Just focus on that connection. You can still drive safely when you're doing that. But say you're not driving, it's anything that connects you with your senses.
Mhm.
So I do this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 thing, and I'll say it quickly just so your listeners can have one more tool. So you look around and you see 5 things in your environment, not judging. I mean, when I first started doing this practice, I was like, oh, I got to pick that up. Oh, there's a dust There's a dust bunny under the couch. No, no, no. Don't interact with it. Just observe it. That's mindfulness. And then 4 things you can feel. So maybe it's the inside of your socks. Maybe it's, hair. Well, maybe not for you, but hair on your neck. um, maybe the texture of your clothes. Maybe your behind if you're sitting on a chair, what that weight feels like. So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear. Sometimes you can hear 3 things. If you really kind of picture your ears as a focus lens of a camera where you can go in and out. And then 2 things you can smell and 1 thing you can taste. And even if you haven't eaten or had anything to drink lately, oftentimes there's still sort of a taste in your mouth. Might not be a particular food, but maybe a little salt, a little sweet, a little tart. And just any of those 5 things, but I like the 5 things because you count down, right? And then by the time you get to taste, you're embodied. You're there. You're present.
Mm.
And you're not activated anymore.
Yeah, they're
Very
just
calming.
and it's just very simple tools and techniques that any of us can use, which is really, really cool. So last question. I'm probably gonna have to have you back for a third go around
We
because
do
there's
have great conversation.
we do, and there's just so much more I want to explore with this. We're gonna have to do this again.
Anytime.
Provide you're not sick of me yet, Michelle.
This is what I love to do this in hopes that someone out there is going to be helped by our conversation. So I'm happy to, I love it. Great.
Me too. And we have the same objective in mind that people are helped by the conversations that we have. Last question. If people want to get in touch with you, contract for your services, find out more about what you got going on, what's the best way for them to do that?
To go to my website, and thank you. This is the easiest question you've asked me. Inhabitjoy.com. Most everything you need to know about me is on that website. I'm also on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. Those are the main ones. Easy to
And
find me, Michelle Ann Collins. You can even Google Michelle Ann Collins and stuff comes up. It's kind of creepy, but how you find me.
trust me, it does. I've Googled Michelle, and there's a lot of stuff that comes up with Michelle, which is a testament to the body of work that she's done over the years. So with that, Michelle, is always a pleasure. And until we do this again,
Thank you. You too. I appreciate you and the work you're doing so much.
likewise. And with that, that's a wrap on another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, wishing you peace.